to the Joseph Benamy Show for June the what's the date today? 26th? June the 26th, 2024. I am your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for tuning in. I do appreciate it, as always. Okay, we have a lot of ground I want to cover tonight, ladies and gentlemen. It's almost I'm almost thinking to myself that I kind of wish that we had more than just the 2 hours, or sorry, the 1 hour that we schedule our show for. We of course have done in the past, we've done 2 hours, but 2 hours is a lot of time to fill in and a lot of work to put into it. So we ended up, as you very well know, reducing the show down to 1 hour. But of course, the problem with 1 hour is you almost don't have enough time to do everything that you want to do. So we're just going to do the best that we can tonight, ladies and gentlemen. As I say, there's a lot of things that I want to cover tonight. And the first thing that I have to bring up, just sort of breaking news in the last couple of days, is the whole affair of Julian Assange. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about the International Criminal Court striking again, issuing arrest warrants for leaders of major countries in the world, at the same time that it's convicting this, I have to say, this nobody. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Not that this nobody didn't deserve some sort of a conviction or punishment, but anyway, hold on to that, save that. We also want to talk about this ongoing problem that nobody seems to be focusing on. You know, you'll find the odd news item on it, but this rash epidemic of burning of churches in Canada. This has been going on now for a few years, and as I say, you'll come across the odd story about it in the media, but generally speaking, nobody is paying attention to this, and I find that to be very disturbing, very disturbing. So we're going to get into that as well. But before we do, let's go back and talk a little bit about this Julian Assange thing, because it's actually a big deal. It's not going to make a big deal, I guess, to your day-to-day life or mine, but this Julian Assange thing has been going on for quite some time. And for those of you who don't know, Julian Assange was the co-founder of a group called WikiLeaks. And what he was responsible for basically was conspiring with a couple of other people in the United States defense, national security, intelligence community to take confidential memoranda, emails, communications, reports, studies, etc., and to take batches of these things and to post them on the internet for the public to see. And I would have to say that probably most of what got posted by Julian Assange and on WikiLeaks was probably not that bad. But it was the act of doing it. And I have to tell you, I know a lot of people that actually think that Julian Assange is a bit of a hero because, he went against the establishment, and there's a very anti-establishment strain right now within the conservative movement, not just here in Canada, but in the United States and in Europe as well, where there's a lot of dissatisfaction right now with the status quo. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the establishment, with the way things have been going lately in government, this seemingly inexorable move towards the left, towards greater statism, towards greater authoritarianism. And so there's a very strong element of distrust within the conservative movement of the whole, let's call it the deep state. I don't like the term. It's very ill-defined, but, a lot of people are talking about it. So let's refer to it as the deep state as well. A lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of distrust, a lot of conspiracy theorizing out there. Some of it might be true, some of it might not be true. But to some of the people in the conservative community that are leaning more towards that, Julian Assange has been a bit of a hero, willing to take on the establishment, willing to publicize what governments have been doing behind the scenes, under the surface. behind closed doors. And I suppose you have to be maybe on a certain level, perhaps a little sympathetic to that, the intention of holding the deep state, if you can use that term again, to account. I'm not unsympathetic to that desire, but I could tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it has somebody who has a background in the military, in national security, and in intelligence, etc. And by the way, I don't work in those areas anymore. I may consult from time to time, but I'm not a spy. My friends like to joke around and call me an international man of mystery, but that's just a joke, okay? It's not real. It's just a joke. But I will say this, okay? I have a I understand the desire to hold the government to account, but at the same time, I'm a very strong believer in people in the military and people in the intelligence, national security community being honorable and guarding the confidentiality of the work that they're doing and respecting the confidentiality of the work that they're doing. And if from time to time it's necessary to blow the whistle on somebody that's abusing that secretive world, the secretive, if you will, environment, then there are channels that are available to people in order to do this. Now, I know that my borderline conspiracy theory friends out there are going to be pulling their hair out right now when I said that, because they're all going, oh yeah, but you trust the system, you trust the system. Well, yes, I do trust the system. I'm not blind to the fact that sometimes the system doesn't work very well, but it's the system, and if there's a problem with it, there are too many good, honorable, decent people who are involved in the establishment in order to be able to correct whatever problems there are that need to be corrected. And running to the public and publicizing intelligence operations, intelligence gathering techniques and technology only puts people's lives at risk. And I know that sounds cliche, my friends. I realize that, but it is true. You don't know, the general public doesn't know, and probably as a consequence doesn't really appreciate the degree of work that's involved, and successful work that is involved in thwarting terrorist attacks. There are many, many attempted terrorist attacks, and attacks that are being planned, that the plans end up getting disrupted, etc. It's not perfect, but you don't hear about these things. You don't hear about the terrorist cell that was disrupted at the front end of its planning due to intelligence gathering, due to good, solid research, and the like. And I'm not saying that you should. It's nice. People should be able to live in peace and feeling of security, etc. But we live in a dangerous world, and there are many, many bad actors out there. Some of them state-sponsored, many of them state-sponsored, perhaps even most of them, to a degree, state-sponsored, or just lone wolves working without any kind of support from any kind of outside organization. There are bad people out there that are planning to do bad things, and with technology the way it is today, with the internet, with the ability to communicate back and forth, it's a far more dangerous world today than it was even 25 years ago, pre 9/11. And our intelligence services are doing the best that they can, and they're doing a stellar job at keeping us safe and secure. And you don't know most of the things that go on. You may hear of snippets here and there, but I can assure you that what you know, what gets reported in the media, is only the tip of the iceberg. Now, along comes Julian Assange and some of the other people that he associated with, and they're treated to a certain degree like heroes because they're whistleblowers, and I can't even say that about Julian Assange, by the way, because there was no real whistleblowing in any of the documents that he released, put on the internet and publicized. Nevertheless, they're treated a little bit like heroes, but you know what they do? They're endangering people who are working in this business to keep you and I safe. Now, I'm not, as I say, I'm not naive. I recognize that in this business, in that business, because it's not really transparent, because it's conducted largely behind closed doors, under the radar, whatever cliche you want to use, whatever metaphor you want to apply, because it's not out in the open, the opportunity for abuse exists, and it exists greatly, much more so than in most areas of government. And A and B, in the desire to keep people safe, the opportunity for the government, even unplanned and unknowingly, to continue down an authoritarian path is huge. And so we have safeguards in place. And if those safeguards start to break down, then certainly there are mechanisms for us to be able to deal with that. But you don't simply throw out the intelligence community. You don't throw them under the bus in order to what? To prove that you're some sort of a I don't know, a populist hero? So when it comes to Julian Assange, I would have thrown him in jail, and I would have thrown away the key. What he did was inexcusable. He and his associates. So what's happened now? Okay, well, what's happened now is after years and years, including, I have to say, 5 years in custody in the United Kingdom, fighting extradition, he finally decided to plead guilty, and the plea deal is that he was in custody for 62 weeks, and so the judge sentenced him to 62 weeks in jail and then suspended the sentence, or not suspended the sentence, but basically said, time served. Is this good enough? Well, it is what it is. And, hopefully we're not going to see a repeat. We're not going to see people following his lead, doing the kinds of things that he did. Because what he did was damaging, and it was potentially devastating for many of the good men and women who are defending our freedom and our safety and our security day in and day out, that you never, ever hear about. And that's what he was guilty of, in my view. I would have sentenced him to a lot more, but this was the only way to get this, close the book, I guess, on this deal, turn the page, close the chapter, whatever, again, metaphor you want to choose. So that's the Julian Assange news. It's a fascinating story. Books have been written about it. I'm sure many more books will be written about it again as we move forward. And, so there it is. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go for our first break. When we come back, we are going to talk about the International Criminal Court that has struck again. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And welcome back to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. It is Wednesday, June the 26th, 2024. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Okay, International Criminal Court. You know, we've talked about this before. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but there have been a couple of developments that I think illustrate some of the problems, again, that we have with the ICC. And, you know, too many people support this institution simply blindly because, you know, quite frankly, you know, you get to say, I support the International Criminal Court, give yourself a pat on the back, and sleep soundly at night, thinking that you've done this great service to humanity. And it sounds, you know, obviously, you know, who's against holding anybody accountable for the most heinous crimes that they could commit, war crimes, crimes against humanity, which the ICC was set up to adjudicate. But there is a downside to it, and you know, call it the law of unintended consequences, although these consequences, I think, could have easily been foreseen. But so the International Criminal Court, let's start off by pointing out the conviction that it just brought down against a fellow by the name of, are you ready? Al Hassan Ag Abdul Aziz Ag Mohammed Ag Mahmoud. And just to show you that I'm good at this, I'm going to repeat that name. A gentleman by the name of, well, gentleman probably isn't the right word to use, Al Hassan Ag Abdul Aziz Ag Mohammed Ag Mahmoud was convicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague for war crimes and crimes against humanity, for his part in abusing prisoners as the de facto chief of the Islamic police in the city of Timbuktu in Mali in Africa. So apparently, let's call him Mahmoud, was acting as the Islamic chief of police for a period of time in the city of Timbuktu, and he was involved in torture, rape, abuse, etc. of prisoners in that country for a period of time. Now, this is a bad person, and he should be punished for his crimes, no question. But is the International Criminal Court the right venue for doing this? Why is he not on trial in his own country, being tried by a jury of his peers in the community where these crimes were perpetrated by the people against whom the crimes were perpetrated? No, we arrest him, or he gets arrested, and he gets shipped off to the International Criminal Court. All right. Put that on hold for a minute. The International Criminal Court also at the same time announced that it was issuing 2 more arrest warrants for senior Russian officials. The former Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the chief of the general staff in Russia of the Russian army, Valery Gerasimov. So the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for these 2 individuals, claiming that they have committed war crimes. And you can add that to President Vladimir Putin and another rather obscure Russian official by the name of Maria Lvova-Belova, who was involved in organizing some sort of a scheme allegedly to deport Ukrainian children to Russia. I don't know the details of it, but so those are 4 arrest warrants of senior Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin. Now, just as a matter of technicality, it's interesting to note that neither Russia nor Ukraine are signatories to the Rome Statute, which was the statute that formed the international agreement, the treaty that formed the International Criminal Court. So one wonders what jurisdiction the International Criminal Court even holds here. That's a technical question, a jurisdiction question. But the more serious problem is when you issue arrest warrants for these senior officials, you have to understand that these are the people that are going to make the peace or no peace decisions in this ongoing conflict, or they're going to be party to the decisions and consequently party to the negotiations if we are to find a peaceful settlement to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So consider this for a moment. Switzerland is a signatory to the Rome Treaty. And so they are obliged, pursuant to that treaty, if they honor the terms, nobody's going to force them, but if they're going to honor the terms, they are obliged to arrest anyone who comes within their jurisdiction for whom there is an outstanding warrant from the International Criminal Court. So consider, this recently concluded peace summit that was held in Switzerland, dealing with this conflict between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now, the best way to resolve these conflicts is for the decision makers to get together and to hammer out some sort of a compromise agreement. Can you imagine what would have happened if Vladimir Putin or any of these other senior Russian officials had traveled to Switzerland to take part in this peace conference? The Swiss police would have been obliged, pursuant to the terms of the treaty, to arrest them. Now, I'm having some trouble understanding how that serves the cause for reaching some sort of a negotiated settlement between the Ukrainian government and the Russian government to end the war. It doesn't. And so the very meddling of the ICC in this conflict undermines the possibility of reaching a negotiated settlement. Now, it doesn't mean that a negotiated settlement is not possible. You don't have to have these two leaders, Zelensky and Putin, sitting down in the same room together. But hypothetically, if they were to do that, to hammer out some sort of an agreement, then, the ICC, the fact that there are these warrants outstanding for the arrest of Vladimir Putin, undermines that. This is not rocket science, ladies and gentlemen. Now, of course, nobody's going to arrest Vladimir Putin. Why? Because he's the president of one of the most powerful countries in the world. Not going to happen. Okay? I mean, the Russians would go to war if he traveled to a country and was arrested and held in prison. I mean, they would. I could see them going to war in order to free him. So nobody's going to do this. Nobody's going to arrest Vladimir Putin. So who do they arrest? Well, they arrest this other fellow. We'll call him Ag Mahmoud, for the crimes that he committed in the obscure city of Timbuktu, in the obscure country of Mali. Now, he's a bad actor, a bad player, a bad person, deserves every punishment he gets. But why does it have to be in The Hague under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court? And if for whatever reason the people of Mali decide, as part of a broader settlement to establish peace, if they decide that they are going to, I hate to use such a trite term, but let bygones be bygones. Basically say, you know what, as Winston Churchill said, if we open up an argument with the past, we're going to risk losing the future. And so sometimes you make these compromises. Sometimes you say, yeah, what happened was bad, it was wrong, but for the sake of peace, we're going to move beyond these. We're going to come to agreements, etc. I'm not saying that's what happened in Mali. I'm not saying that's what should have happened. But the very fact that the government, that the people of Mali might have done that and then have that ignored, that agreement ignored by the International Criminal Court, undermines efforts to make peace and to end conflicts. Yes, this fellow, Mahmoud, should be held accountable, but he should be held accountable in the country where he committed the crimes. And he should be held accountable by the people against whom the crimes were committed. And if they choose not to do that, then that decision, right or wrong in the eyes of the international community, should be, if not respected, it should be adhered to. And the same thing with Vladimir Putin and his colleagues. If the Russians and the Ukrainians come to some sort of a compromise agreement, and as part of that agreement, they decide that, we're not going to pursue some sort of criminal justice process against one another, then that is something that we have to accept. So many things that we have to deal with in the international community and in life in general is, decisions are often not between right and wrong. They're between right and more right, or wrong and more wrong. And we have to make the best decision, and sometimes the best decision is not to be purist. Sometimes the best decision is to be purist. But sometimes it's not. The International Criminal Court is an abomination. It does not help anything. It does not help anybody. And it should be abolished. That's my ICC rant for the day, ladies and gentlemen. And we're going to come back in a couple of minutes. And when we do come back, we're going to get into this whole thing about church burning in Canada. This is a very serious topic, and it's something that needs to be really addressed seriously. So don't go away, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. Thank you for staying with us. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Wednesday, June the 26th. Did I say June the 24th earlier? I have written down here June the 24th, and that is a pretty big mistake, actually. You know, this is, if you've listened to this podcast before, you know, for some reason, this is the most, the simplest aspect of doing a show live. And for whatever reason, it's the area that I seem to screw up more often. Well, certainly more often than I care to admit. I don't think it's more often than not, but one would think that this is the simplest thing, and it really is. So there's no accounting for this anyway. It's not June the 24th, ladies and gentlemen, in case I did announce that earlier. It's June the 26th, 2024. And yes, I am your host, Joseph Benamy. And yes, as I already said, thank you so much for staying with us. All right, let's move off of the International Criminal Court. Let's forget about the shenanigans of Julian Assange. And let's talk a little bit now about a very serious problem that we have in Canada right now that nobody seems to be talking about. You know, since October the 7th, everybody's talking about anti-Semitism. Everybody's talking about pro-Palestinian demonstrations, anti-Israel demonstrations being held in major cities across the West, and including in Canada. Everybody's talking about pro-Palestinian takeovers and encampments at university and college campuses across Canada and in other countries as well. Just this past weekend, there was what can really almost only be described as a pogrom in Los Angeles, where pro-Palestinian thugs, and there's no other way to describe them, thugs, were picketing and protesting outside of a synagogue in Los Angeles. Now, if you read some of these news reports on that particular subject, and I want to get to Canada in just a second, but this is important. The news reports talked about the violence that had occurred outside of that synagogue this weekend in Los Angeles and characterized it as pro-Palestinian protesters clashing with pro-Israel protesters. And that's just nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. There was no pro-Israel protest, pro-Israel demonstration at that synagogue. There were members of the Jewish community who reacted, I think, understandably, to the incitement of the pro-Palestinian protesters. But they were not, the Jews were not a counter-protest. This was their synagogue. They had not organized something that, the pro-Palestinian protesters are going to be here. We're going to be on the other side of the street. And somehow or other, we ended up fighting together. No, that is not what happened. And I'm not shocked anymore by the idiocy of the mainstream press on some of this stuff. But still, all in all, as I say, I'm not shocked, but it is shocking. And along those lines, here, and I appreciate the attention that's being paid by so many people in the mainstream media defending the Jewish community. I really do. I appreciate it. I recognize it. I thank them for their support. But I do have to ask a question. Why are we ignoring this horrendous problem in Canada of churches that are being targeted and being burned down? This is not a couple of churches, ladies and gentlemen. Back in January, the CBC, Canada Broadcasting Corporation, issued a news report that pointed out that going back to May 2021, there have been 33 churches burned in Canada. And 24 of those fires were confirmed arsons. 33 churches, ladies and gentlemen. And that was in January. Since then, there have been a handful more. This is a very serious problem. Now, nobody is beating up Christians on the street. And it's pretty hard to identify who Christians would be on the street. All the same, ladies and gentlemen, this is a serious problem that we have in Canada, and nobody's talking about it. And I'm going to be critical of my own community. While it's very fine to focus on anti-Semitism, I think that's a very appropriate thing to do. Focus on anti-Semitism, yes. But at the same time, how can we ignore this campaign of destruction of Christian monuments and Christian of churches? It's not right. And we, in our community, should be at the forefront of calling it out, calling it what it is. It is anti-Christian bigotry. And there were many, many other examples of anti-Christian bigotry that are not as stark as burning down churches. But we're not even talking about burning down churches here. And that's very troubling to me. And I think that we in the Jewish community should be at the forefront of demanding some kind of government action in order to prevent this kind of thing from happening. But there's too much silence. In fact, it's not. Is that even a real term? Too much silence? This is what we're getting. We're getting silence. We're getting silence from the mainstream media. We're getting silence, regrettably, from our own community. And it's really not on. So where is this coming from? Well, for starters, the rash of church burnings, and there have been church burnings in the past, but the sharp increase started when all of the talk started about residential schools. And by the way, I'm not planning on spending any time talking about this, but let me tonight just make one important observation about residential schools and the alleged, mass graves, et cetera, et cetera. Something that you're also not getting from the mainstream media, which is, again, very disturbing. And that is that it turns out that the myth, and I'm using the term myth, of the mass graves and mass killings at residential schools in Canada was just that. It's been debunked. Categorically, authoritatively, finished. It did not happen. But the mainstream media, having made such a big deal of it, government having made such a big deal of all of this stuff, and having sown the seeds for the ongoing violence against Christian institutions, physical destruction, and nobody's talking about it. Nobody's talking about the consequences of what they did and what they said and the positions they took at that time and the rush to judgment without clear evidence. Is that the reason why churches are being burned? Well, it's an awfully big coincidence, isn't it? I don't know that this is the reason. Maybe it isn't the reason. But it's a huge coincidence, ladies and gentlemen. And again, what are we doing about it? We're not doing anything about it. Has there been an RCMP or a special task force formed by the police? Not to the best of my knowledge. Has CSIS, Canada's intelligence agency, domestic intelligence agency, been specifically tasked with finding out what's going on. Is there coordination? Is there a conspiracy afoot here? I don't know. But to the best of my knowledge, nobody's taking it that seriously. Each of these church burnings is being treated in isolation from every other church burning. And I think that that's a very big mistake. What we see emerging in Canada is a shift from the anti-Christian sentiments that have been fomented largely by the government of Justin Trudeau and his compatriots, his ideological fellow travelers in the mainstream media and in the political world as well, who tend to characterize and portray Christianity as a bad thing, as being, the alt-right. And so we're seeing a transition from the bigotry and dare I even use the term hate speech that's directed against Christians into now a period of actual physical violence. And one has to ask themselves, ladies and gentlemen, what will it take for the government to take this seriously? What will it take for our police services to take it seriously? And yeah, I'm sure they take it seriously to a certain degree. I'm sure that they're investigating these things vigorously. But the question that they're not asking is it coordinated? And are they treating it as a coordinated type of crime? And are they treating it the same way that they would be treating anti-Semitism? Or more to the point, almost non-existent Islamophobia? How many mosques have been burned down in the past 3 years, I ask you, in Canada? And with that troubling question, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go for our third break. Don't go away. We'll be back more on this subject when we come back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Welcome back. You're tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Wednesday, June the 26th, 2024. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. We have been talking about the ongoing rash of church burnings across Canada and the number of churches that have been burned in Canada up to January of 2024 was 33 since the late spring of 2021. So in 3 years, less than 3 years, 33 churches burned to the ground in Canada. And of those 33, 24 were confirmed to be arson. The others, generally, we just don't know for what the cause was. But I think it's safe to say that some of them would have been arson. Possibly some of them were accidental. And since that report in January by the CBC, there have been a handful of other church burnings in Canada, most notably a famous one in Toronto. Historic church burned down in an act of arson. And the question I'm asking, ladies and gentlemen, is why are we not talking about this in the mainstream media? The question I'm asking is why are the police not taking it seriously? Now, again, I'm sure that they're taking individual cases of arson seriously, but why are they not treating this as some sort of a coordinated effort? And if all of these actions were indeed independent, there still is a common denominator, and the common denominator has to be, I think it's obvious, anti-Christian hatred, anti-Christian bigotry. But nobody seems to be talking about it, and I'm troubled by that. And I think you should be troubled by it also, because this is not happening in some foreign country. And I can't, while I mention foreign country, I would be remiss if I didn't point out, I have to say it, ladies and gentlemen, as concerned as I am as a member of the Jewish community, as concerned as I am about anti-Semitism, as worrying as all of the anti-Semitism, increase in anti-Semitism here in Canada and in the West in general and throughout the world has become very troubling, very disturbing indeed. But be that as it may, the religious group that is the most subjected to religious persecution today are Christians worldwide. Now that may just be a function of the much, much, much larger Christian community than the Jewish community. Perhaps if there were hundreds of millions of Jews in the world, as opposed to fewer than 20 million, perhaps we would see a cataclysmic rise in anti-Semitism and acts of violence against Jews. I don't know. That's idle speculation. What I do know is that there is a great deal of anti-Christian bigotry out there fed by our own politicians who get a pass on it because it's Christians. And that's just plain wrong. And if what we see happening in Canada is any indication, then one has to ask themselves, is that bigotry contributing to a growing level of violence directed against Christians? I don't have the answer to that, but it's a question I think that needs to be asked now in our community, in our country. And again, nobody's asking it. And you know, I have to point the finger at my own community. Again, it's understandable that we want to focus on what's going on and the dangers that our own community is facing. Perfectly understandable. But at the same time, I think that it would be reasonable. I think that it's incumbent upon us as victims of religious persecution. I think it's incumbent upon the Jewish community to also call out persecution and bigotry directed against other religious groups, and generally we do when it comes to other religious groups. But for some reason, we don't talk about Christians. And I don't think that that's right. I think that we need to recognize that this is a problem. It's a growing problem. And at some point in time, the violence is going to go beyond burning of churches. And this is my great fear. We're going to go beyond burning of churches to actual assaulting Christian clergy or worse. There needs to be, just as our government, just as the Prime Minister has made it plain that there's quote-unquote no place for anti-Semitism in our country, usually accompanied by the ritual there's no place for Islamophobia in our country. But at the same time, we need leaders in our country standing up and saying there's also no place for anti-Christian bigotry in our country. We need our political leaders. We need our cultural leaders. We need our non-Christian religious leaders to stand up and show solidarity now with the Christian community and say, this is not acceptable. It's not acceptable when it's directed towards Jews. It's not acceptable when it's directed towards Sikhs. It's not acceptable when it's directed towards Hindus, Buddhists, or Muslims. And it is certainly not acceptable when it is directed towards Christians. We need to recognize the scourge of anti-Christian defamation in our country. Because if we do not call it out, and I'm not talking about hate speech laws, ladies and gentlemen. I hate hate speech laws. I hate the idea of hate crimes, period. I don't want to see anyone punished especially harshly because what they did was motivated by hate as opposed to whatever. But here's the dirty little secret about our hate laws, ladies and gentlemen. If somebody who perpetrated arson against a church is arrested and charged, they will not be charged with committing a hate crime because Christians are not recognized as a target of hate, potentially, in Canada. They're not one of the identifiable groups. Now, I'm not calling for them to become an identifiable group for hate crimes legislation. I don't think that any group should be, because I don't think that you should punish somebody particularly harshly because what they did was motivated by hate. As I always say, if somebody vandalizes my property, I want them charged and punished for vandalizing my property. I couldn't give a rat's ass why they vandalized my property, and I don't think that that should even be taken into consideration, because that's a really difficult thing to prove. And I think that it takes the focus off of the real problem, and the real problem is the vandalism, not what drove it. Look, if you want to have a debate with psychologists and social workers and sociologists and psychiatrists and everybody else about motivation and all of that stuff, that's fine. Have at it. But when it comes to punishing people for having committed a crime, I don't care. And neither should the law. The law should not care about why they did it. So I'm not calling for any kind of special consideration or special laws passed in order to to address anti-Christian hatred. I'm just demanding that we call it out, that we just recognize that it exists, and let's not put our heads in the sand. And when our political leaders, Justin Trudeau et al., when our political leaders use language that provokes, encourages bigotry and hatred towards the Christian community, they need to be called out on it. And the community that I think should be front and center in calling them out on it is the Jewish community, my own community. And it's high time that the police take this, I think, their investigation, and they're dealing with this up a notch. I'm not claiming that there's a conspiracy here. I'm not claiming that it's coordinated. But I think that that's a question that needs to be answered at this stage. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We live in very troubled times. And talking about troubled times, today's Wednesday, the 26th of June. Tomorrow night, the first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden in the leading up to the presidential elections in the United States. That, ladies and gentlemen, is something that I think will be very much worth tuning into. So that's my recommendation for entertainment tomorrow night, Thursday the 27th, on CNN. All right, ladies and gentlemen, coming to the end of another interesting and perhaps even a little bit depressing Joseph Ben-Ami show. That's not my intent. I call them like I see them, ladies and gentlemen. All right, check out the website, www.josephbenami, all one word without the hyphen. While you're there, don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter. And we will catch you next week here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Until then, stay safe, God bless, and have a great week.